welcome back. Today we have with us Norm Ryder. Norm and I have known each other for quite a few years now. We've worked on issues around public exposure to electromagnetic radiation, such as that emitted from Wi-Fi networks and cellular telephones and such. And Norm has spent a lot of time researching government regulations and also following carefully any changes that have been happening over the last few years. So basically in Canada, electromagnetic radiation is governed by the federal government and through Health Canada and through Industry Canada. So Industry Canada has now looked at their guidelines for public exposure, and there's been some changes. So I've asked Norm to come in today, and let's talk about what these changes are and look at what the ramifications might be for the public. So welcome, Norm. Great to have you here again.
Thank you.
And I see you've come with all your literature. So basically, I think I've explained Safety Code 6 as best I could. But maybe you should start there also, maybe expand a little bit about what Safety Code 6 is and what these revisions have that Health Canada has made.
Well, Safety Code 6 is a code of allowable limits of radiation for federal government workers or people at federal government sites. For example, it doesn't cover us here. Also has some very strange things that it looks just at the effect of the thermal effects of radiation, which falls far short of where the problems are.
So Norm, I know this, that Safety Code 6 does not cover the general public. Now, how is that? I mean, why are these regulations just used for federal employees?
Because the code is designed just for federal government situations, and the provincial government and the municipal governments are falling down in providing any protection. WorkSafe BC does cover a little bit. It covers workers, but that really creates a strange scenario that you have the teachers in a classroom covered by the radiation, but it's okay, you can zap the kids with as much radiation as you want. Mind you, the teachers aren't protected that well because Safety Code 6 is so inadequate in so many ways.
Now, what is, we know that these are guidelines, so therefore they're not like strict regulations, but what are these guidelines based upon, and what's their measurement of harm and safety?
If it can raise the body temperature or part of the body by 1 degree Celsius in 6 minutes, then they declare that harmful. Now, when you think about it, when you're working, when you're exercising in hot water, your body raises by 1 degree Celsius. The temperature rise really has nothing to do with it. There's something else going on other than just a temperature rise. But they're basing it on that is what causes the problem.
So I know, I mean, that always leads us to the issues around harm. And so what is the difference between what their model of harm is, which is some kind of thermal model, and what is the differences between that and, say, what's happening on the ground when people are being harmed by the radiation?
Well, where the standard should be is probably about 300 times more protective, just to make that they have found things like blood clumps at much lower levels than what Safety Code 6 does. That Safety Code 6 is probably one of the least protective codes in the world that you can find. Even the City of Toronto has a standard that is roughly 100 times more protective than we are covered in BC. India, Russia, China, over half the world's population is protected by standards 100 times more protective than what we have here.
So do you think those regulations are taking into account not only the thermal effects that we mentioned, but these biological effects that seem to occur exposure levels that are much, much less intense than what it actually takes to heat the tissue.
Well, those standards are based on what they call protective standards, that they don't find a lot of problems at lower levels, although they do definitely find at much lower levels of radiation can cause biological harm or reactions in people.
So now the Health Canada has changed tweaked these regulations a bit. What's happened there?
They've made actually a major change that's still far from adequate. They have lowered the allowable limits for the areas or frequencies we're most affected by from 1/3 to 2/3. Apparently that is so it would be more protective for children and pregnant women. But they're also telling us the radiation doesn't cause a harm, so how could you, what's more protective if there's no harm? But that's basically what they've done, is they've lowered those standards quite a bit. Still far from adequate, but a major improvement.
So they seem to be taking into account some of these biological effects, even though they're not officially saying that.
They're not admitting it. It's obvious they're starting to realize there is a problem there.
So, okay, so do you think, like projecting ahead now, do you think that Health Canada's now opening up that door a little bit now, or do you think it's just a one-time sort of concession?
I think people are beginning to realize that around now there is a parliamentary committee, health committee, studying Safety Code 6. Now, what changes they will come up with and what they'll recommend, I don't know, but they, for the most part, seem to realize that a serious revision of the code is required.
So yeah, perhaps maybe those legislators meeting and what's the name of that committee?
It's the Parliamentary Health Committee. It's the MPs in Ottawa are discussing it.
So I mean, maybe that's the catalyst that's kind of getting Health Canada moving a bit.
It is starting to move. There's still a long ways. So one of my big issues that hasn't been addressed much is what they call near and intermediate field radiation. It can actually extend out quite a ways from a large antenna for some frequencies up to about 74 feet actually.
Yeah.
And they can't model that area, that there can be very high spikes of radiation in that area that can cause major harm. That Safety Code 6 just doesn't recognize that issue at all.
Because they're basing their guidelines on what we know as far field exposure, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, far field that's where that inverse square law comes into effect, and there's a number of other ones that we all know. But in closer, that's a totally different discussion.
It's very interesting that it's that large an area.
Well, that's one of the worst case scenarios, but it actually could be twice that quite easily.
If you lived in an apartment building and you had an array of antennas above you, you might be getting a very intense exposure. So I think that's something that Health Canada has to take more seriously.
The only way to check that is to actually send somebody in with a meter and test it. You can't calculate it and guess it.
Yeah, so like I know we want to kind of keep this file going. That's why I brought you in today, because when we have things that are happening, I think the public should become aware that there are people meeting and there are members of Parliament that are concerned about this issue, and that they're working on our behalf. There are some people that are actually doing something good. So thank you so much for coming in, Norman. We're going to have you back again for sure.
Okay.